Hello and welcome. I'm Al Barrows, and this is UFO Disclosure, the podcast that's meant to show an average person's reaction to all the UFO, UAP news from everywhere and anywhere. Today, I'd like to relate and comment on a story I found on the Lost Stories podcast. It involves a 1976 mass UFO sighting in the Canary Islands off Spain. It all began the night of June the 22nd, 1976, when the crew of Atria, a Spanish Navy corvette stationed offshore south of the island of Fuerteventura, observed a light rising off the coast. In his deposition, the captain reported that at 21:27 hours on June the 22nd, they saw an intense yellowish-bluish light moving from the shore towards their position. Initially, they thought it was an aircraft with its landing lights on. Then when the light reached an elevation of 15 to 18 degrees, it became stationary. The original light went out, and a luminous beam began to rotate, remaining for approximately 2 minutes. Then an intense halo of yellowish and bluish light developed and stayed in the same position for 40 minutes, even though the original phenomenon was no longer visible. The captain wrote in his journal that 2 minutes after the halo appeared, the halo split into two parts, and where the lower part of the halo was, a blue cloud appeared, and the upper part of this halo began to climb in a rapid and irregular spiral, and finally vanished. So if you guys can imagine a full moon cut in half, the top half is what flew away, and the bottom portion became a bluish cloud. None of these movements, the captain wrote, affected the initial circular halo, which remained lighting up parts of the land and ocean, indicating the phenomenon was close to them. The corvette's captain's testimony was confirmed by a whole host of witnesses, among them a doctor from the island of Gran Canaria residing in the town of Guya. So there was a widespread observation of this phenomenon. This was a highly visible event with thousands of people witnessing the luminous sphere in the sky. The impact of the sighting was further amplified by the subsequent fascination with the camera footage showcased in newspapers and in official documents. The phenomenon began on the night of June the 22nd, 1976, as residents of Tenar, La Palma, and Lera reported seeing unusual lights in the sky. These lights and their maneuvers were unlike anything anyone had seen before. Local sightings reported that the phenomenon flew horizontally, stopped, or accelerated, and these observations were later interpreted by journalists as evidence supporting the idea of extraterrestrial crafts. Newspaper headlines the following morning proclaimed that thousands of people had witnessed a spectacular phenomenon lasting 20 minutes, with the most sensational aspect being the sighting of a sphere occupied by strange alien beings. Intriguingly enough, it was the Spanish government who communicated this to the newspapers. How about that? That's transparency from the government for you. Maybe our U.S. government can learn a lesson here. The government provided this information to the newspapers, and it was provided by a senior official of the Spanish Air Ministry who wished to remain anonymous. The fact that such an authoritative source provided this information underscored the gravity of the sighting and alarmed the wider public. Interest in the case was reignited in 1994 when the military files were released under Spain's version of the Freedom of Information Act. The 1976 report was extensive, containing over 100 pages of testimony, evaluations, drawings, and more. In the report, the phenomenon is described to have begun with what witnesses described as a strange sunset. And there's a few sketches here provided if you guys have a visual on this. It all started with a strange sunset as the sky darkened. Zigzagging yellow lines with intense brightness emerged on the horizon, seemingly rising from the sea towards the cloud and moving along it. Over time, rings formed within the cloud, extending to colossal sizes, and the cloud itself took on an iridescent and dense luminosity. At 8:08 p.m., a silver disk emerged from the horizon in the same direction as the initial line, leaving behind a zigzagging trail of reddish fire. It reached the lower part of the iridescent cloud, passed through it, jerked, and then ascended almost vertically, just 10 degrees below vertical, then made a brief left turn, flew horizontal for a few seconds, and then ascended steeply again in a parabolic trajectory toward the islands. As it ascended, it left behind a massive luminous trail in the shape of a cone or wine glass with the silver disk always at the tip. This enormous trail illuminated the Canary Islands, making the phenomenon visible even from Africa. The 94 report is ripe with interesting facts, but two internal memos from the Spanish Air Force stand out, both directed by the commanding general of the Canary Islands Air Command to the lieutenant general of the Air Staff in Madrid. In the first memo, dated March 23rd, the general stated that to counter the speculations these events are generating and to curb certain unscrupulous individuals exploiting the public's good faith for their own benefit, it might be advisable to request information from the U.S. Armed Forces to see if they could publicize with certainty that the phenomenon was produced by them. Okay, so that's reasonable. They want to make sure that it wasn't the American military, which happens to have a big footprint in Spain. There's a lot of U.S. forces stationed in Spain off the Canary Islands. The official Air Force report also included depositions from 14 witnesses where liability was assessed based on social status, believe it or not, with a doctor's report given high priority, whereas a common labor report was given less weight. Despite this unfair standard, all witnesses were in full agreement about what they saw. Okay, so this portion involves a doctor that was being transported on an Uber and happened to see this sphere associated with the phenomenon very close to the vehicle that he was in. So on June the 22nd, 1976, at around 21:27 hours, Dr. Padron Leon was traveling by taxi with Santiago del Pino. So the doctor was on his way to see a sick woman. It was a clear, starry night. As they rounded a bend, the driver and the doctor were both startled to see a perfect sphere about 60 meters ahead of them, or about 196 feet ahead of them, hovering a few meters off the ground. The car lights pointed at a slightly luminous sphere that was stationary. Now, this part is very unique, gives a very unique description of a UAP that I, for one, have never heard before. So I think this is probably one of the better parts of this whole report. So it was a slightly luminous sphere that was hovering above them or before them. It was stationary and very close to the ground. They started to experience a terrible feeling of cold. Dr. Leon said in his statement to the Air Ministry that the chauffeur even started trembling, especially when the taxi's radio, which had been turned on, suddenly cut out. The sphere was transparent, like a giant soap bubble, with a diameter comparable to a two-story house. Inside, they could see a platform, some panels, and two large beings. The cab was only a short distance from the patient's house, and upon arriving, the doctor observed a type of bluish smoke coming from a tube, rising through the center of the object. The bubble was made of a totally transparent and crystalline material. The film had an electric blue color, though tenuous and not dazzling. It had a radius of about 30 meters, or approximately 98 feet. And in the lower third of the sphere, you could see a platform of aluminum-like color, as if made of metal. and there were three large consoles at each side of the center. They were two huge figures of 2.5 to 3 meters tall, but no taller than 3 meters, or approximately 9 feet tall. They were dressed entirely in red and facing each other in such a way that the doctors saw their profile. The doctor said that they were surprised. It was majestic. It looked like the sphere was drawn with a compass. It was so perfect. Inside, they could see tall beings dressed in red suits and black helmets. The beings faced each other, and around them were instruments with flashing lights. What surprised the doctor most was the disproportionate size of their brains. So I guess they had elongated heads. Then he observed that the bluish smoke continued to spread from the semi-transparent central tube within the sphere, spreading across the periphery of its interior without leaking anything outside. Then the sphere began to grow and grow until it became huge, like a 20-story house. But the platform and the crew remained the same size. The doctor said it rose slowly and majestically, and he thought he heard a very tenuous whistling. Another witness, a lady who was a relative of the patient who the doctor was about to see, was watching television when suddenly the screen went blank and her dogs began to bark outside. Running to a window, she saw the doctor's cab and the blue sphere above it. So there was a direct witness that saw the doctor and the sphere. She saw that the sphere was transparent with two blue lines inside. Shocked, she closed the window. So I guess she didn't want to have anything to do with it. She closed the windows and stayed indoors and began to pray. So this is a very rural part of Spain, and they're very religious there as well. The home of the doctor's house call was only yards away. Dr. Leon left the vehicle as the craft continued to rise. He ran to the house and started banging on the door and telling those inside to come out. They did, and they saw the sphere rising. It began to pick up speed. Eventually, at a blistering pace, it shot out of sight, transforming into a bright white beam. The sight of the ship didn't make any sense to the doctor. He could not relate what he had just seen to anything else he had ever seen in his life. Didn't know if it was something that he needed to see a psychiatrist for. The doctor did say that afterward, he did experience a great sense of clairvoyance. After observing the ship, he noticed a great clarity in his intelligence. Now, this same UFO, or an identical one, was seen 2 minutes later on 4 other Canary Islands by thousands of witnesses at the same time. Radars officially recorded the passage of a craft. A quick calculation established that the UFO moving from the south of Ventura to the north of Gran Canaria had a speed of 3.6 kilometers per hour, or approximately 3.728 miles per hour. On June the 22nd, 1976, there was a real UFO tour over the Canary Islands, as an object was also seen south of Gran Canaria. It was leisurely photographed by a witness who was present. And I guess this is the photograph here that you're seeing if you guys have a visual on your screen. The 36 color photos he took were authenticated, and the apparent dimensions of the objects corresponded to the doctor's observation. Clearly, phenomena were observed in the Canary Islands on June the 22nd, 1976. The details were published at the end of March 1977. The numerous testimonies, those from the Spanish corvette captain, the radar data, the doctor's testimony in Guya, the photos, and the semi-official information are so consistent that the existence of the UFO phenomenon cannot be denied. Dr. Padron, for his part, shortly after the declassification of the FOIA, or Freedom of Information Act documents, and by then, 18 years after this encounter, shared additional details that further deepened the mystery back in 1976. But Jerome had already mentioned in his statement that he did not feel fear during the encounter, but rather a strange sense of well being and excitement. The observance of the craft by all who saw it was accepted as genuine. On the other hand, the witnesses of the smaller orb with aliens were classified as unreliable. The actual presence of the beings was questioned. In other words, the witnesses were believed to be truthful, but for many, what they claimed to have seen was too far-fetched. In 2001, science journalist Ricardo Campo and Vicente Juan Bajeros uncovered what they believed to be the true cause of the phenomenon. After extensive research, which included interviewing witnesses and exploring the possibility of extraterrestrial involvement, they turned to ballistic missile data. Their investigation suggested that the sighting was caused by two Poseidon C-3 thermonuclear missiles launched by the U.S. Navy submarine USS Von Steuern on June the 22nd, 1976. The missile's rapid ascent into the thermosphere likely caused intense atmospheric reactions reflecting sunlight back to Earth and creating the bright, large-scale visual effects witnessed across the Canary Islands. Not all questions had been fully answered. So most people back then in 1976 in Spain accepted the phenomenon as true, but the reports of seeing extraterrestrials during and after the phenomenon were considered too outlandish to buy into. So was it just one big sphere that people saw in the sky? Was it a blast from a missile launched by the US Navy? Or were there more than one sphere? Were there more than one UFO? Perhaps if it was a military blast, it did attract the attention of UFOs, and they were observing it and checking it out. And even though the reports of seeing ETs by people like Dr. Leon were considered too outlandish, in the military report that was released in the Freedom of Information Act, did have him documented as one of the, if not the most credible witness. I thought this was interesting because it's not commonly reported, and the observations that Dr. Leon made of the bubble, transparent sphere with the very tall beings inside, I thought that was very unique also. Hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I did. My name is Al Barrows. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks.